All right, everyone. This is not just a special guest interview. This is a very special guest interview. And it is because I am sitting with what I consider to be royalty today. And she is just one of the most esteemed, impressive, brilliant, talented people I know in this industry, in our shared passion on dealing with narcissism, all things narcissism, the effects of narcissistic abuse. Dr. Ramani Devasula, I think I'm saying that correctly, is really something else. And I'm going to tell you first a little bit about her, and then we're going to just get into it and share a dialogue together. But I am so grateful to have you here. So, Dr. Ramani is a licensed clinical psychologist in Los Angeles, California, professor emerita of psychology at California State University, Los Angeles, and the founder and CEO of Luna Education, Training, and Consulting. She has written many fabulous books, including her most recent New York Times bestseller, It's Not You, which we'll get into a little bit today, I hope. The focus of her clinical, academic, and consulting work is the etiology and impact of narcissism and the effects on the people who are dealing with them, general mental health effects from dealing with narcissism, societal issues, etc. Her work has been featured just about everywhere: television, TEDx, a million podcasts. She has an incredible YouTube channel that has had millions of views. And I'm going to let her say a little bit more about herself, but I will stop there to say thank you for being with me today, because I am excited to sit with you.
Well, Wendy, that was a stunning introduction. And, I'm always like, oh, I don't want to sound narcissistic. So that's always at the top of mind. But thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, I have to say, it's such a privilege and honor too. I've read your work. I'm very aware of where your work has been in. So it's rare that I get to talk to someone who brings the expertise in narcissism. There's a very short list of people where I get to actually, it's usually somebody coming and saying, teach us about this. And you know so much about it. So we get to have a deeper conversation. But, I think that this is a really interesting conversation in the world of mental health, which we don't often talk about, which is we talk about narcissism. We've talked about narcissism for 100 years in the field. But we've almost never talked about the effect of this on other people in any kind of systematic way. That's really what my focus is, because it is such a unique issue in that, for example, there is a robust literature on what, for example, being the caregiver of someone with dementia is like, or the effect of addiction on families.
Yeah.
But those are states. Like dementia is viewed as an unfortunate state. We viewed it almost treated as a health condition. Addiction also is viewed through a disease model, and we know that this is a suboptimal state.
Yes.
Narcissism opens up an entirely different window. Here is somebody who is vaunted by the world, revered by the world, rewarded by the world, and yet is doing often a lot of harm to those closest and most vulnerable to them. So that dichotomy has raised a really uncomfortable series of truths in the world of mental health, which has made this a far more thorny patch than I ever thought I'd navigate through. And the thornier and meaner it becomes, the more I want to do it, because I'm like, if I'm doing this even from an intellectual perch at times, because I've lived it, but in an intellectual angle, I'm thinking, I know people are continuing to get hurt. And so because that dichotomy of everyone saying, you're so lucky that this is your mom, that this is your husband, that this is your boss, and the internal experience of falling apart leads to a lifelong pattern of taking responsibility for somebody else's harmful behavior. So that's what I'm hoping we get to the core of here.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so well said. And you and I have chatted a little bit about this behind the scenes, and I guess we'll be talking about this together on a couple of stages coming forward.
Yeah.
Which I'm looking forward to.
Me too.
Debunking the myths about this
Yeah.
as well. So, we know that the commercial internet is flooded with the term narcissism now, narcissistic abuse. Everyone's a narcissist. Talk about
Yeah.
yourself for 3 minutes. You're a narcissist. So, can you say a little bit about, when you were writing this last book, how it's evolved for you, your appreciation of this particular pathology, this particular set of traits, and its effect on others, and what we really need to know in order to emancipate ourselves from
Hmm.
the situation.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Wendy, because, and I'm sure you're seeing this in your work as well, is that in the last, I would say really 2 to 3 years, we've seen such a popularization of the term. And, there's a cynical corner to this because unfortunately, a lot of folks who put content out on social media, on whatever platforms they use, they're doing this entirely in a data-driven way. And what the data is saying is people want to know about narcissism. So now people are often throwing up very black and white and simplistic takes on what is an extraordinarily nuanced conversation. Personality is always a nuanced conversation, right? I think that, and one of the big issues we have, and this is where folks like even Dan Siegel's work and all of that become really interesting, is that we don't talk about personality enough
Mm.
when we talk about doing therapy. When you think about it, how all of us were trained, you do an intake, you do an assessment, you determine what brought someone in to talk to you. And typically, sadly, we use a deficit disease model of what's
Right.
wrong with you, right? Something's wrong or you wouldn't be here, right? And then we issue a diagnosis and we slide into this very medical space, which we're pressured to because
Mhm.
that's what the insurers expect. That's even what our record
Yeah.
keeping software expects of us, right? So we issue a diagnosis. But the thing we don't pay attention to, and I always call this, if there's a song, there's the boom, 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 the bass line under the song we don't appreciate. But if that bass line was taken out, we'd be like, oh, that sounds like a very different song. Well, to me, personality is that boom, boom, boom bass line that
Mm.
rarely changes that much.
Mm.
And it is why some clients are so much more able, we can work with them in such different ways than others. It's why with what two exact same diagnostic presenting issues, one client, in 8 to 12 sessions, we've made significant change, which we've charted and measured. And in the other client, not only do we feel we've made no progress, we actually think we might have backslid and are doubting ourselves as a therapist. That often comes down to personality, right?
Mhm.
So this narcissism conversation it's a double-edged sword. I think the bad part is we are oversimplifying what are very complex issues,
Yes.
and people are using this term narcissism as a punitive hammer. And that's a real problem. A second problem comes up because everyone's using it, now there's a sort of a pendulum and a reaction to that. Oh, everyone's saying everyone's a narcissist. So that what happens is now this incredibly useful, I want to say powerful word loses its heft, I should say.
Yeah.
That means that people who actually are in narcissistic relationships, the group that already has a tendency to doubt themselves the most, is really doubting themselves, saying,
Mm.
like, oh, maybe I am making too big a deal about this. Maybe I am reading this wrong. So now they're often doubling down on, like, maybe I'm the one who's being judgy or mean or whatever. And they sort of stay the course in a relationship that's harmful. The good thing is we are having this conversation.
Yeah.
And maybe the good fortune would be that somebody sees this term, says, some of these patterns are adding up. And there are good books out there. There are good podcasts out there. There is good content. It's difficult for people to find it. But that one simplistic social media post, like, oh, married to a narcissist, you better leave, that's dangerous because we know darn well, not only is that not an option for a lot of people, it could actually sometimes be a potentially dangerous option. You have a narcissistic parent, go no contact. That may not be what somebody wants. They may say, can you help me work around this? Like, so every Thanksgiving is not a fraught nightmare. Yes, we can work around that.
Right.
So I think that when we say things in 30 seconds or less, we simplify nuance. Narcissism is all about nuance.
Mm. Gosh, that's a really terrific answer, and so true. There's so much dimensionality in there
Yeah.
that has to be considered. And we have to consider there's no such thing as absolute anything. I mean, maybe, yes, absolute safety, safety above all else, but there's no absolute path even to that for
Mm-mm.
everyone. It may
Mm-mm.
not be an option. The options may be dangerous. So we do have to consider and be flexible, like a good therapist would be flexible in the work when helping someone who's
Mhm.
trying to deal with these particular issues. Congratulations again on your book.
Thanks.
It's really amazing. It's Not You is such an important body of work. And you discuss, I put a few little questions together here as I was thinking about the book. You discuss the subtlety of narcissistic abuse and how individuals can begin to recognize the less obvious signs in their relationship. Because, we see all these, again, going back to the internet, these glaring terms about what you can see in a classic, grandiose type of narcissist. But there are subtleties too that also
Mhm.
count.
It is, I think it's not just the subtleties, but it's also capturing the idea that this is on a continuum. The
Yeah.
mistake we've made is somebody, it's a black and white. You're narcissistic or you're not. And we know that's not at all the case. That spectrum from mild to severe, and my book, It's Not You, is written very much for that moderate level of narcissism,
Mhm.
not just an annoying kind of selfish, vain, emotionally stunted person, but certainly not the severity of the coercive, exploitative, almost dangerous person. In that moderate range is often where people get kind of stuck with all the,
Mhm.
this is not healthy. I do not feel good here. I do not feel psychologically safe here. However, I also don't feel in fear of my life.
Mm.
So it's a very, and in that way, people get more stuck, right? Because like, well, I'm not
Yes.
really in danger, but this is also really not good for me. But because it's on this spectrum, can you imagine a person who's in a very mildly narcissistic relationship with somebody who, again, who's very superficial, very interpersonally shallow, perhaps quite materialistic, very selfish, again, very immature, having a
Mm.
conversation with somebody who's in a relationship with a malignant narcissist where we're seeing severe manipulation, isolation, exploitation, and coercion. This person in the milder relationship is going to say, okay, I'm not using this word right because I am not having this experience, but they're both using the word correctly. So
Right.
not only is it on a continuum of severity, there are also subtypes of narcissism.
Mm.
And you know this, Wendy, better than I do, is that when we're talking about grandiose narcissism, which has often been sort of the armchair and even the framework that diagnostic formulations have used for narcissism,
Yes.
the grandiose narcissism, the attention seeking, the extroversion, the charm, the charisma, the but still the admiration seeking, the entitlement. But what we do know, interestingly, from the literature, is actually grandiose narcissistic folks with their really, really anodyne kinds of defenses. They have better outcomes than the other narcissistic
Yes.
folks because they actually are, they do have like they have this other, again, they have the extroversion, so they do have supports, they have this ability to actually work through problems to their benefit,
Mm.
but they don't tend to fall down the rabbit hole of negative emotionality in the same way, in the same, or not as quickly. They can get there but not as quickly. But when we talk about vulnerable narcissism, and I have to say that conversation in the last 5 years has really moved the needle. Whether people are calling it covert narcissism or vulnerable narcissism, it's here that people are saying, okay, I wasn't dealing with the charm and charisma and grandiose version. I was dealing with this sullen, angry, brooding, aggrieved, disenchanted, passive aggressive, punitive person where they had all this stuff, the marginal empathy and all that, but it wasn't coming out shiny.
Mm.
And many people who are in relationships with vulnerable narcissists, it's more, again, this more negative mood, even like a vulnerable narcissist can actually look depressed, they can look socially anxious, pulls not only for all the discomfort of a narcissistic relationship, but also the discomfort of pity and guilt, where a person's like, this person can't, they can't even go through the world without my help. It's almost like having this eternal aggrieved 16-year-old who screams at you when you ask them to empty the dishwasher, but they're 50. And that's not nearly as like hopeful an experience. Then we have malignant narcissism, which again is usually a manifestation of the more severe form, not so grandiose, not so, I mean, not, I shouldn't say not so charming, not so charismatic, but very much like I always say, it's like a near cousin to psychopathy. So it feels more coercive, it feels
Yeah.
more dangerous. These are people who are willing to sort of commandeer legal systems or any systems to harm someone. And then we have these more subtle nuance types, which a lot of people resonate with, namely communal and self-righteous narcissism. Communal narcissism in particular, the person, and this, it's funny, Wendy, I recently have done some consultations around this and some trainings around this, which
Mm.
is the person, and then think about this, you have someone in your life who's so very helpful.
Yeah.
They send you a goodie basket just when you need one,
Mm.
or they invite you to all their get-togethers, or they're always doing favors, not just for you, but for lots of people. They throw big holiday parties and they make sure a flower basket gets sent to the sick person. Like they don't miss a mark. Okay. That said, if you run afoul of that communal narcissist, if you say, hey, listen, fruit baskets and all that are good and well, but I'm a little hurt you didn't invite me to your dinner party. You will get a cobra lash at you. Like it will be like, I've done so much for you and you're bringing this up. Remember, the shame has been activated in the communal narcissistic person who cares how they look to the world. But
Yes.
people don't, they're like, oh, they're getting their validation by being viewed as the helpful one. And
Yeah.
I said you weren't so nice, and boom, I got attacked. But I'm like, where's the flower basket? Like, because that's usually what this has been about. And then we have the self-righteous, more judgmental, moralistic, but yet plays entirely by the rules. So it's not that kind of shady, slipshod, unfaithful, grandiose narcissist. It's this person who is almost like a holy roller. They're so on the straight and narrow, but they will very quickly pull their support if they feel that you're not completely in line with their rigid worldview. Growing up like that is a nightmare for someone
Mhm.
where any form of individual expression or just being a kid is shut down.
Yeah.
That your bed being made is far more important than the internal distress you're experiencing
Mm.
and sharing. So you can, but now you can see if somebody's having a conversation, malignant narcissistic relationship, self-righteous narcissistic relationship, this all looks different. But what the consistency is, we don't feel seen, we don't feel heard, we don't feel safe. That's a
Yes.
constant, but it has a
Yeah.
lot of different flavors.
Yeah, that's really good discernment of all of the different types. And then there's the blurry lines, right? I mean,
Mhm.
being someone who has treated people who are narcissistic or on the narcissism spectrum for years, I've seen some of the blur. And what
Mhm.
I was listening to, I loved when you said, the vulnerable covert types, they're not as shiny, right? They're not as shiny. And I think whether they are communal, self-righteous, vulnerable, covert, there is also still an element of entitlement. Entitlement kind of runs
Always.
through
Yeah.
all of it,
Mhm.
right? The
Mhm.
sort of low empathy, high entitlement, and the identity, right? There's something about this is my identity, don't touch it. So in treatment, it's this is my identity. Like I can't even offer empathic appreciation for the suffering that no one sees how much I do and I give and I,
Mm.
right? The constant search for adulation, appreciation in the more vulnerable types. They don't even want necessarily the empathy or compassion around this suffering that they're putting out there because it's a martyrdom, because it is,
Mm.
right? This is my extraordinary identity. And it's always about the extraordinary. It's just
Yeah.
what I call an extraordinary victim, if
Mhm.
you will. So we have
Mhm.
to wrangle with that a little bit differently, don't we?
I mean, I'm so curious about this because it's the you're saying I want to explore that with you a little further. This idea of don't take away my identity, and the idea being don't take away my identity as this special, grand, helping humanitarian of our time, right?
Exactly.
How do you link that then to shame? Because it always to me feels as though the that in so the example I gave, they always get they send the thank you notes, they do the
Yeah.
this, they
Yeah.
they have you over to their big extravaganza Christmas party, whatever it is. But then you notice you weren't invited to something by them. About, they had a dinner with friends, you consider yourself part of that friend group, they don't have you. You say, "Hey, I'm hurt you didn't invite me." At some level, it also feels as though there is a somebody's calling out that person
Mm,
who's the communal narcissistic, person, and some shame has been activated
yeah.
because the shame is somebody's basically saying you're not so great. You didn't get this one right. And although making one mistake for healthy persons, like, ooh, I didn't get that right, and we own it and we say it, and it doesn't feel great. We might even feel a
Right.
tiny bit of shame, but the shame is intolerable. It's completely at odds with that identity.
Hmm.
And so it doesn't fit. And
Yeah.
that's the lash.
Yeah.
Like, how dare you pull back my specialness? How dare you activate my shame? I will now punish you. And so, for the vast majority of people in these relationships, if you don't know what you're dealing with, you won't see it as like, I don't want to activate their shame anymore. You'll say it as like, oh, I better not go there with them. Right. And so, in order for the relationship to continue, we have to start silencing ourselves more and more. So, we're not showing up as our true selves anymore. Like, if you want this relationship to persist, you don't get to bring up these things that
That's right.
bother you. If you do, it's going to be an argument, or you have to distance from the relationship. And that's not always an option.
That's exactly right. You have to forfeit your voice in this
Correct. You have to
relationship
forfeit your.
because it
Mhm.
becomes either just too unbearable, the constant arguments that will come up, or the constant put downs, or the constant distortions of reality. You're right. A partner doesn't know that that's shame that's being activated. It's not just shame, it's a toxic level of shame. It's what you said, it's intolerable shame. They don't know that. They know that they're activating something that's kind of ugly and uncomfortable. And I don't want to be in the face of that anymore. I'm tired of walking into the fire. But they're activating shame.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think all of this martyrdom, virtuous victims, super sufferers, extraordinary identities is a compensation for that
Yes.
shame, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's what we're
And
talking
right.
about.
It comes and that shame, like, I always liken it as like you're about to throw up and
Yeah.
you got that's it's the throwing up.
Can you say a little bit about how the effects of narcissism or narcissistic abuse differs from other types of abuse? I mean, you talk
Mhm.
about this in the book.
Yeah. So narcissistic abuse, I mean, listen, any emotional abuse has some universal effects, right? Because ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to attach to an unsafe object. And when we try to do that, it can, and because we're being abused by the person we're trying to attach to, we have to make modifications in ourselves. And if we don't understand what we're dealing with, the series of things that happen include rumination, regret, a sense of loneliness and isolation and alienation,
Mm,
anxiety, sadness. Even we might even feel irritable. We feel frustrated. We blame ourselves. Maybe I could have said that differently. Maybe I should have done that differently. We doubt ourselves. Did I say that? Did
yeah.
I do that? Did I try?
Mm,
Um, and then we also see a sense of, and so as if the abuse is protracted enough, what if it's harmful enough, if there's no sense of escape and you can't make sense of it, really mild dissociation. You start becoming numb. You stop becoming you. You're
yeah.
distanced from that because your you doesn't work in that relationship. And we even see not only physical symptomatology, like people don't sleep as well and they don't eat as well. We are actually tracking in our communities, and we've asked hundreds of people, much higher rates of autoimmune symptomatology of all kinds and all kinds of physiological fallout.
Wow.
Many of these folks said, I didn't have this before this relationship. And, we know that relational stress is unique because it's often inescapable. So that's what happens to a person. But what's unique about narcissistic abuse is that it's not always like this. There's a lot of vacillation.
Yeah.
And you know this from working with narcissistic clients. If the narcissistic client feels well supported, well seen, well validated, well supplied by the world, their interactions with people close to them can actually be quite nice. They just got the promotion. They come home, they whisk the spouse around the room. Let's go get dinner. Let's go on vacation. And so there will be these desperately craved normal and even more than normal, wonderful moments sprinkled into gaslighting and manipulation and betrayal and
Mm,
invalidation. That backing and forthing, that intermittency makes this a unique space. And what really makes it a unique space is that cycle of backing and forthing. That's not unusual in a lot of abuse cycles. Is that the point I was making at the top of the show here was that narcissistic people often present beautifully in society. And a lot of people will say, they're so generous, they're so nice, they're so smart, they're so helpful. And so now the person in the relationship was saying, this isn't healthy. Well, we have some good days. And they're already struggling with that trauma bondedness, as we call
mhm.
it, really struggles with it when the world is saying, but they're a great person. And so that's what can often keep people stuck. And then when you throw in there cultural expectations around relationships and the fears of being alone and the practical issues around leaving, this is a really, really unique space because the narcissistic person is often really slaying it in the so-called real world. Not always, but often.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mention in the book, it brings up a thought about, I mean, it's the title of the book, it's not you. And you mentioned that it's really important for individuals who are dealing with narcissistic others in their lives. It's really important for them to get to a place where they can alleviate self blame.
Hmm.
And you bring up the concept of radical acceptance.
Hmm.
Can you explain a little bit
Hmm.
about that for people listening?
Yeah, so one of the best definitions I've ever read about radical acceptance, because it's a tricky term, right? Acceptance to us means like agreement. We often conflate acceptance and agreement, right? It's not about agreement.
Mm.
It's seeing a situation clearly and unyieldingly. You're not signing off on it. You're not saying it's okay. You're not good with it. And it's not as though you're immune to being hurt from it, but you see it. And above all else, you recognize this is stable. This is not likely to change. So even if there are a few good moments thrown in there, we're coming back to
Mm.
this bad situation, what it typically is, harmful and unsafe and inconsistent and all of that. Radical acceptance is not an easy place to get to, because to do that really for a lot of people feels like a cataclysm, right? Not only is there tremendous grief, people believing that this person I care about, that I love, that I've built a life with, that is my family, will change. It is a very, very different reality you're stepping into, and you're like, this isn't going to change. This is it. So that actually becomes a call to action that we have to live our lives differently, right? That's a heavy lift. Develop different kinds of supports. Some people say, I'm out of here. This is not a marriage to me. Some people say, I do not want to see this family as much. It's big moves. And we don't like making big moves when attachments are going to be disrupted. That's really uncomfortable. So basically, radical acceptance is the ultimate challenge to a status quo. But the status quo has come out of wanting to keep it as it is, but also from not understanding what you're dealing with.
Mm.
Over time, as that grief passes, and there will be grief and it's real, because what you hope for is lost, what you thought this was is lost, that you now slide into a world of realistic expectations. Now, for some people, and I consider this a significant fork in the road, some people say I'm done. Like, no, 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 no. If this isn't going to change, I was tangoing with this because I thought we were going to make this into something better. Some people will get a divorce. Some people
Right.
will leave the relationship. Some people will go no contact with family members or quit the job or whatever. Many, I'd say at least half, won't do those things. They'll stay, but they'll stay armed with realistic expectations.
Mm.
And this is where things like, oh, okay, I'm never going to be seen in this relationship. This person, I've never going to protect me. This is never going to feel like a safe space. So sadly, I do need to build this up in other areas of my life. And that whatever function this marriage serves, maybe people say, I don't want to tango with family court. I wait till these kids turn 18 and then it's a different conversation. Some people will say, this parent is already older. I'm going to wait for them to pass. I don't need to rock this, rattle this cage anymore, but I'm going to really keep my distance. I am no longer going to talk to people as though they're listening to me, but you can't live like that without someone
Mm.
listening to you. And that means building up friendships, relationships, finding those family members you do have close relationships with, and engaging with those in deep, authentic ways that
Mm.
your true self emerges. It's a really tough way to live, though, in some ways, Wendy, because you're really bifurcated. There's a true version of you that gets to be in the world with other people, and then there's a version of you that has to be very careful. And then there's another big question that floats out there when we're thinking about radical acceptance is how much were you harmed by this relationship? Because people who experience protracted, severe, inescapable narcissistic abuse, it's not unusual for them to look like they're presenting with complex trauma.
Mm.
So the person getting much more stabilized, feeling more in their body, really addressing all the fragmentation that comes from that kind of interpersonal trauma,
Mhm.
that becomes the early passes of the
Yes.
work. And then slowly coming into that, being educated by this, because some people are so destroyed by this that we don't just hop right to
Yeah.
education. We start with stabilization. And there is a lifelong grief that I call a fellow traveler for anyone who's gone through this, because these are such significant relationships,
Mm.
parents, siblings, um, partners and spouses, friends from childhood, really big, heavy, meaningful
Yes.
relationships. And it feels unjust and it feels unfair. And it also, a lot of people will say, the grief is so much work because there's never closure. There's never the moment where the narcissistic parent or partner says, you did right by me and I didn't do right by you, or I'm sorry for how I betrayed you. You're not getting that. You can heal without that closure, but it's harder.
It's
And so all
harder.
of these things make it harder.
It is harder, and when you said, acceptance is not agreement, it's the same thing we talk about regarding empathy. Empathy
Hmm.
is not agreement. Empathy is
No.
understanding. Empathy is making sense out of something. It's not
Mhm.
compassion, it's not sympathy, right? I talk a lot about empathy. You talk a lot about empathy and the power of empathy to free us, because when we get it, when we really get it, we really make sense out of it. I mean, a lot of people will say, Wendy, it's so tedious. Why do I have to spend all my energy understanding this? Because it will free you up, because it will
Yes.
be less about you
Hmm.
when you understand what's really going on. And you will see how you've been dancing in this
Yes, yes, yes.
really
Hmm.
difficult,
Hmm.
haunting melody that's playing all the
Hmm.
time.
Hmm.
I guess what I see sometimes, and we've spoken about this and we'll speak more about this, I'm sure, in the future, is that there is a path that can lead to recovery and
Hmm.
hope, but it's really small.
Hmm.
It's a really tiny percentage that get there, unfortunately. It
You
is,
mean of the narcissistic people? Yeah.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah,
Hmm.
it's a
What?
really tiny, it just takes so much. And most of them won't do the long sit that is
Mm,
required. And most therapists don't want to treat them. And most treatment approaches are not designed to work effectively or go deep enough or into the dark
yeah.
waters to really get there and make the difference. But I do think, like, what you said is so powerful in terms of crafting a life for yourself. If you are staying
Yeah.
and you are realizing that true self, or you sometimes call it that true north, when you're out there in the world with others, that when you are home, when you are around the narcissist, if you can get sturdy enough, you can have a voice that still
Hmm.
reflects who
Hmm.
you are, what matters, your truth, regardless of what comes
Hmm.
from the other side.
Hmm.
You learn how to actually expect it, and can become white noise, right? It can just become white noise
Hmm.
over time, but it's hard. It's
It's
really
it's
hard.
very hard. I'm curious though to ask you what, because you say it's this very, very tiny group of people where there is enough of that change for there to be this path forward to recovery
Yeah,
in relationship.
yeah.
In your work, what have you sort of identified as any consistent factors that are associated with greater likelihood of a successful outcome with a narcissistic client?
Yeah, it's essentially three things. I mean, I think it's really high leverage. So really high stakes consequences have to be there
Mm,
for the narcissist, something they don't want to lose. That and it might be even
mm,
something incredibly superficial, but it matters enough to them to drive them into therapy.
yeah,
Now, they better meet the right therapist who's
yeah.
got a sturdy back, who's really able to see it, to sniff it out, right? To be able to
Yeah.
feel it and to know how to empathically confront it, to
Mm-hmm,
address it so that you
mm-hmm.
can shift the leverage into the therapy relationship. Now, you, the therapist, become the important person in the narcissist's life. They don't want to lose you. And it might
Yeah,
start as just a game, but
yeah.
that's okay. It's always a game for a little while. And eventually it becomes something that's important because they can see that there is a shift in the burdens they carry to be
Mm-hmm,
ultimate performers in
mm-hmm,
whatever rank and file they're sitting in.
mm-hmm,
The third thing is the treatment approach. If the treatment approach is a
mm-hmm,
lot of talk, it's not going to be enough. It must be emotion focused. It must go
mm-hmm,
deeper. You have to get into the deep dark water so they can actually become
mm-hmm,
empathically acquainted with
mm-hmm,
themselves, because they're not going to be able to step into the skin of someone
mm-hmm,
else until they can
mm-hmm,
step into their own skin. And they're
mm-hmm,
always living outside their own skin. I mean, they're being guided by it, but all that shame and that
mm-hmm,
insecurity. But they've got to learn how to step into their own skin and really correct the biased emotional experiences that they've carried for a lifetime. It's a
mm-hmm,
beautiful thing when it happens. It
mm-hmm.
just doesn't happen enough because
Yeah,
those
it
three
doesn't happen
factors
in,
aren't
yeah.
usually present.
Mhm. And I'd also argue that in the midst of all this, you're going to need resource. You're not doing this in 12 sessions.
No.
And I think that's the
Absolutely.
challenge because when you think about it, right, what your average bird who might be using, insurance, there's no way. I mean, first of all, we can't even record this as a diagnostic impression on paperwork, or it's all going to come pushed back at us.
Right.
So this is people who can dig into a pocket and
Yes.
pay for this kind of therapy. So
Yes.
we were talking about a very rarefied
Yes.
experience as well. And so I think what's important though is for people to recognize it is rare. And so the odds that this is going to be what happens in your story, listen, if you have that story of that person who's going to commit, and Wendy, something I've seen is that narcissism can sometimes have what I call a rock bottom.
Mm.
Everything blows up.
Yeah.
They've lost the marriage, they've lost the affair partner, we're being publicly shamed in their business, they're losing all their resource. Now, we also know that rates of suicide in people who have narcissistic personalities are higher than average, right? Because when the entire facade crumbles, there is not the internal resilience characteristics, and this is particularly significant with vulnerable narcissists. The
Yes.
grandiose defenses and the grandiose narcissist can sometimes keep them safe, but in the vulnerable narcissist, we can see complete and utter
True.
collapse.
Yeah.
So if even that all gets navigated through, you might have somebody who's just been brought down to their core essence and they've lost everything. The challenge, though, becomes in all the people they've harmed. The narcissistic person may come to therapy, actually do the work. But part of what they think should happen is that everyone should come back and rally round. And the partner may say, I'm glad you're finding your path forward. It's just not going to be with me. And
Right.
I've seen that result in a new spate of rage, as though the narcissistic person says, are you kidding me? I did all this vulnerable stuff. I should get my life back.
Yeah.
And that sense of entitlement to the former life, not recognizing, no, you broke it and you bought it and it stays broken kind of thing. Like you don't there's no getting this back.
Right.
But you've gotten something wonderful and new that you might be able to use forward. I've seen that happen, and I've seen a lot of guilt in survivors who say, I see they're doing the work, but I don't think I could ever trust them again. And why would they?
Uh-huh.
That I'm like, you're not a monument to being like their emotional support animal. Like you were hurt and it's okay to move on. It gets complicated.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and so you pointed out about five or six more challenges and obstacles that are confronted when we talk about treatment. I'm
Hmm.
not hopeless about it, but I do appreciate that there is a lot to bypass in order
Yeah.
to make a
Yeah.
difference.
Hmm.
And when I am working with a partner, as I'm sure for you too, this is the case, I want to give them as many tools as possible to be able to resuscitate their voice
Hmm.
again, to feel that sense of inner advocacy for themselves. Talk about the steps. You go into this in your book in a lot of really beautiful detail about some of the steps people take once they begin to notice that this is what they're dealing with.
Well, so if you do notice it is what you're dealing with, and and there's that moment you're like, okay, this definitely tracks as narcissism. Like I said, that first stop on the train, in fact, sadly, the first stop is the hardest stop, which is slowly, radically accepting. And I will say to people, listen, write down all the things that make you uncomfortable about this relationship. Write down the things you dread talking about. Write down the things that are chronically disappointing you, right? And really take a look at that. Once it's on paper, you often can't deny the heft of it. And that can often facilitate radical acceptance. The piece about radical acceptance also gets tricky because I think sometimes people say, I feel worse now that I see it than I did before.
Mm.
Right, because there was this almost mildly dissociated structure that got set up. And Dr. Jennifer Fried writes about it beautifully when she talks about betrayal blindness,
Mhm.
that not all the betrayals get encoded in the same way, because if the betrayals got encoded as betrayals, they would disrupt the attachment and all the other status quo of our life. Well, now you're encoding all of this. It is incredibly uncomfortable. And
Yes.
people are like, I kind of wish I didn't see this, right? But I have to the piece that I try to teach people is I saying, don't think not seeing it didn't have a cost. You were sick, you weren't sleeping, your health
Yeah.
didn't feel right, you were sad, you were irritable. All that smudgy, gluggy stuff in you, that's all that too. So the not seeing it came with a price. And I
Mm.
really will say to people, pick your price here. I mean, I'll be frank with you, Wendy. I can recall clients back in the day who would drop out. Survivors, not narcissistic folks, would say things like having signed prohibitive prenups, or knowing the realities of family court, or knowing they were with someone who was very, very fighty, as it were. And they would say, they would say things like, I like the lifestyle. And what I signed, I would be moving from a palatial 6-bedroom home to a 1-bedroom apartment. And I don't want to live in a 1-bedroom apartment. I like having resource. I like my lifestyle. I just
Mm.
don't like this.
Mm.
And I would still say, though, if they're navigating it with eyes open, like to say, it's okay to want these comforts. It's okay to find some safety in that. And then many times there's a deeper story to that, having grown up with not enough,
Mm.
right? I think that people want to say, well, I sold out. You didn't sell out. The sellout is not allowing yourself to see it.
Ah.
The cognitively dissonant, seemingly impossible line to walk is, I see it and I'm going to engage it, but I understand why. It's like it's eyes wide open. It's buying the house with the leaky roof.
That
You
is
know,
so
saying,
beautiful.
you
That's
know,
beautiful. Let's just
that's
stop
what it is.
and appreciate that for a second, because that is
Mhm,
absolutely beautiful. And I so like jive with that, that idea that,
mhm,
come by your choices as choices,
mhm.
thoughtfully,
Yeah.
reflectively, not
Yep.
reactively. Don't operate from that default state, because that's a
Mhm.
high price. Then you're kind of selling your soul,
Yep,
right?
absolutely. And so that seeing it and not judging it, because I think people will say, well, I feel like I've sold out, and I said, you haven't sold out. You're seeing what this is about, and there's realities to this,
Nice.
right? And it's okay, and it is okay.
Mm.
So but if you, I said, but to not see, you're going to get sick again, right? We're trying to get you not sick. So that's the seeing it. So the steps are this, and radical acceptance isn't like one, it's like you do it and you're done. It keeps coming back, and people will say, I would get pulled back into the cycle. I would get hoovered back in, as we say, or I would get what's called future faked. I would be promised something, and once again, it would be snatched away. And these would be the harsh reminders. But it's to understand these are the dynamics, because many survivors will say, well, see, I'm foolish. And it's not, you're not foolish. There is you don't you're attaching to all the things that this relationship is, and some of those things are inherently disappointing, and it's very hard to attach to something disappointing. And then over time, like I said, it's about building up social support. And the big work, the big piece, is start slowly giving yourself permission to individuate and become more autonomous, because for the narcissistic relationship to work, and I put to work in quotes, is to give up on yourself and become what they want. The narcissistic relationship subjugates us. It consumes us entirely. It's the only way it works. And I mean, not without conflict, in a way that works for the narcissistic person. When you don't play that ground game, when you don't play it like that anymore, it will feel a little more tense,
Mhm.
right? Because you may want that true self to emerge, which is really the most important thing. Now, what I often say to folks is that I want you to think of your true self as like a really, really precious piece of jewelry that you may not want out in a dangerous place, right? So you're going to cover up that true self when you're around the narcissistic person,
Mm.
because they're going to snatch it off your neck, as it were.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wow.
But there's other places I want you to have that thing loud and proud. And that's what I call the step of discernment. Where
Mm.
am I safe to show up as my true self?
Nice.
And that might be friends, that might be therapy. I mean, one of the most beautiful things in doing survivorship work and therapy is the client will come in with a piece of good news, and very almost like a meek child, like, Dr. Ramani, I sent that plugin and it got published. And I'm like, okay, that I'm so proud of them. I'll say, now look at me with your eyes and
Yeah.
tell me you did that. Because it was so terrifying to share good things that would happen to them,
Mm.
that the averted eye is very much a trauma response. So we get two for the price of one, not just the sheer joy of the accomplishment, but also the chance to see that you can be courageous with that. And through the courage that can slowly start building in the relationship of therapy, it can start generalizing out, because we know this.
Yeah.
We know that the dichotomy of trauma is that the trauma survivor desperately wants to be in a relationship and is at the same time terrified of relationship.
Mm.
And we know narcissistic abuse is a relational trauma. And if we look at all the work on relational trauma, go back to Judith Herman and all the way forward and back, what we know is that the only way to heal relational trauma is in relationship. That integral human structure has to be made safe again.
Mm.
That first stop is therapy, but then therapy cannot be the only stop, because that's a very specifically curated relationship. We're giving clients the muscle and the courage to start taking this into other places and slowly show that true self. Again, this
Mm.
massive, beautiful thing about your neck in certain places. And that could be anything. It could be some place you volunteered, and some place people would be work, and some people, again, it would be one or two friends. It's not like you're going to find a big community like this.
Yeah.
I think our true self, if we look at humanistically at this, it's a pretty small group that can tolerate really being with our authentic selves. You only need a few. And then you do learn that we can't be this everywhere. And then we start learning when we need to button up a little. And people say, well, isn't that inauthentic to button up? I said, no, no, no. You know when to make yourself safe. There's nothing more authentic than that. As long as you know that there's other times that true self can be there and that true self can guide and that true
Mhm.
self needs to be cared for. So if you do have a narcissistic encounter afterwards, you're going to need a minute and you're
Mhm.
going to need to breathe and you're going to need to take care of yourself. And that might mean going to bed early or eating a healthier meal or journaling and getting it out of here, putting it into your book, or whatever it is, reading, exercising, walking, playing with a cat, whatever it is. You have to intentionally care for yourself, saying, that much time of me not having that true self, that is taking a toll on me. I
Mm.
need to care for it.
It's like it's
That's the
suffocating,
work.
isn't it? It's
Yeah.
almost like there's a suffocation
Yeah.
happening.
Yeah.
It's not even, it's the way you say that. It's lovely. I mean, it's just really all makes such good sense. I know we don't have enough time to go through the 1,000 questions I have, but there's just a few more things. And one thing that just came to mind as you were speaking about this is the client who says, "But Dr. Ramani," and this is sort of phenomenological, I think. Um, if I can't bear the thought of actually leaving this relationship, knowing that my partner may end up, now that he's in therapy and he's working on himself, and what if he ends up in a relationship and somebody gets all the goodies that I didn't get? I mean, I can't bear the thought of being the one who missed out on the goodies.
I mean, how many times if I had like if I got a buck
I
every
know,
time I
right?
heard that, right? So many times I hear that. And we break this down a couple of ways. Listen, Wendy, I'm going to be frank with you. In the vast majority of cases, the next person's going to have exactly the relationship that you had. So let's talk about that. But I try to bring the conversation back to safety,
Mm,
right? Would you ever be able to fully feel safe in this space again? Instead of what the next person is going to get or not going to get or whatever, it's would you ever be able to feel safe here again?
yeah.
Right? And most people would say, yeah, probably not. Um, but I hear that. And this is why, though, I think it's a bit, it's why this work can get tricky is that we have to hold space for our clients being hoovered back in. And the way we have to almost like the way we watch a child who we watch know is about to skin their knee in the playground. I'm like, they are not listening to me. And I think they're going to have to skin their knee on this one. This is the only way we're getting this lesson through on this one. And I pick them up and bring them into our arms. We can't bubble wrap our kids, right?
Mm,
We also can't bubble wrap our clients.
nice.
And sometimes the client, it's not our job as therapists to convince them to not go back.
Right.
It is our job as therapists to help validate, mirror, and create an inner world for them that they feel that they can turn to and rely on and make decisions from. And we will not abandon them, critique them, judge them, or shame them when they do make a decision that's very likely going to end up right back where they started. And I'll always say, we learn something in every Hoover. So there's no such thing as a wasted Hoover.
Nice.
Okay.
That's
Other than when
great.
there's, I would only say that's the case when there's not physical harm present. But assuming there's no physical present, we've learned something. And holding that non judgmental space, I have found over the years to be something so crucial because therapy then became the safe space for them to say, I had dinner with them last night. And again, this whole thing, I'll say, okay, let's look up, tune up, and say, tell me about dinner. What was it like? And they might even say, like, oh man, it felt like the beginning again, and felt so good to put on a dress for someone. And it was like I felt like I was getting that old them back. And and validate that feeling.
Mm,
Now they have the safe space because when it inevitably falls apart, and it will, they can bring that back too.
absolutely.
And so that's where I'm saying is that we as therapists, we are not coaches. We're not saying, no, you can't go back. Now
Yeah.
we're doing what the narcissist did to them.
Right. Right. No, we are, I mean, in schema therapy, which I practice, we are kind of limited reparenting agents. So we're
Right.
not telling them what to do, but we're guiding them to begin to think for themselves, to really
Correct.
work on what you just mentioned, that autonomy, right?
Hmm.
That kind of self-definition and getting clearer about experimenting and
Hmm.
discovering
Hmm.
and not living in the land of regret
Right.
and constant sense of shame or embarrassment. I love that. Two more things, just quickly. Tell our listeners what inspired you with this particular book. You've written so much.
Mm.
What inspired you in writing this book?
All the books about narcissism are written about the narcissists. That's really what it was. It was what happens when we make a book that's entirely survivor centric,
Mm,
right? That was because I let's face it, I mean, it's the same reason we watch true crime and we watch series about serial killers. We are gripped by people who have the capacity to hurt us, who
Mhm.
don't always play by the same social rules. We're fascinated by it. We want to understand what hurts us, right? But I really believe we have to understand the hurt in us.
Mhm.
And then we have to understand what it does to us. And then we have to understand how we can come out from under it.
Mhm.
And so that was really where the thinking was. And again, there's countless books on not only on narcissistic personality and people, but also all the various dynamics and all that. But what we don't talk about as systemically is how to heal. Can you heal? And I was really important to me that we didn't just make this about healing after you leave. Because I
Mhm.
think that's the point of view that's used by most people who write about this. Like you leave and then you'll rise like a phoenix from the ashes. And I'm like, a lot of people can't leave. And so that's a
Right.
group that often feels shamed, unseen, foolish. And yet it's I would say it's well over half of folks. In fact, I would argue all of us have one narcissistic relationship we can't leave, whether it's because it's an employment situation, a elderly parent situation, a minor we have minor children together situation, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Everyone's grappling with this. And what I do find is that when people stay and they're given sort of the whole kind of playbook, they're told how this works. Most people will get to that point of disengagement on their own terms. The on their own terms was everything. But
Yeah.
that's really what this particular book was meant to be about is you can heal regardless of the choice you make about the relationship. But the hard part of it is keeping your eyes wide open and having trust in yourself as you go
Mm.
forward. Because a lot of people say, how will I ever trust anyone again?
Yes.
It's going to be a different kind of trust going forward. I don't tell people, no, you're going to go back to your puppy dog, wide-eyed, which some people never had, by the way, if they had a narcissistic parent.
Right.
But it's not going to be first love trust. It's going to be much more discerning trust. It will be gradual trust, and that's okay too.
Yeah. And more trust in yourself as you
And
go.
trust in yourself. The more you trust yourself, the more people don't feel like they hold all the
Mm-hmm.
power of the concept of trust, and it doesn't feel so all or nothing.
Thank you for sharing that. I mean, a
Mm.
lot of the people in my community will be, they are the people you're talking about.
Yeah.
They're in it still and trying to
They're
figure
in it.
out how to heal while they're in it. Can you say a little bit about your program, your healing
Yes.
program? I mean, I
Yes.
know you have a lot of goodies on your website. Everyone should go to that website
I
because there's
appreciate
lots
that.
of good stuff there. But say a little bit about the healing program.
Yeah, I am so proud of our healing program for multiple reasons. The curriculum is so robust.
Mm.
The depth and richness of the questions I get every month show me people are getting it. Now it's an interesting community, right? Some people are coming in for the first time on a month, and some people have been there for 2 years, right? So they themselves start becoming peer educators. We have this really wonderful community platform. So it's a closed platform only for the members. So whereas other platforms like Facebook and stuff can get tricky, people can
Yes.
find their way in.
Yes.
You have to be in our program, and we moderate it a dozen times a day. I have two magnificent people who are the moderators. They're constantly watching it, managing it, getting in there, helping people feel safe. Again, we're trying to create safety in all the things we do. And people can, we have a topic every month. Like last month, February is actually a really powerful month. We talked about how narcissistic abuse affects your physical health. And
Mm.
so many people came out of that month saying, I felt so validated. Like I thought I was losing my mind,
Mm.
and I thought all of this was in my head. And they'd been told a lot of their health issues were in their head. And they were not at all. And they said, this all tracks. And that they said, this is really going to be an important step for me in terms of healing, even physically. So I am so proud of it. I put a lot of effort into it. Every month is almost like a new research project for me, but it's such a pleasure to do it, knowing it's getting right into hands of survivors. It's a fantastic program, and people can come in for a few months and say, you know what, I got what I needed. Some people
Mhm.
stay in for years because they love the community. So you can come in, you can leave, you can come back. So it's the sort of thing, again, fostering autonomy, letting people know you can use this program however it feels best to you. So
Mm.
that's our healing program. I consider that sort of our most intensive offering. for people who really want to commit to the work for a little while. Now, our next level down, I consider the Dr. Ramani Network, which again, so proud of this. I'm working with a phenomenal, phenomenal team on this. And in the Dr. Ramani Network, think of it as many episodes are basically the equivalent of a live podcast. So people listen, they might be listening to you and I, right?
Mhm.
But they can also come on and ask questions. So you're listening to a podcast, but then you're like, I want to ask a question, and you can be brought on. And sometimes we get to the question, sometimes we don't. Some weeks are only the questions, right?
Mhm.
But again, a really great community. But in this case, we have a lot more experts and guests and, all of that. So we've talked about all kinds of things. Dating. We had recently had Mel Robbins on about her new book. This week we're going to be talking about sex. And so we bring in different experts, conversations. That's a lighter lift, and it's more of like a lot of people can just peer into that if they
Mhm.
want. It's not as much of the intensive. We have journal prompts and all that in the healing program. This is a little this one's sort of like what, people who want to get more information and hear from other survivors and what they're going through. We have that as well. And then for people who say, listen, I don't have resources or I just want to learn more, you can go to our YouTube channel. We put out new content
Mm.
every single day. It
Yeah.
is a massive library of thousands of videos, and we have likely made a video on your topic. And if not, tell us, and I will do the research and see if we can talk about it. So YouTube's free. People can go on there and get all kinds of guidance on on what they're interested in. And then, of course, if you're a therapist and you want to get training in how to work with clients experiencing narcissistic relationships, I have multiple trainings available through PESI,
Mm.
and one that even culminates in a certification. So, and there's the big training and there's other smaller trainings. And we also do cohort model stuff where we talk about cases. So we have a lot of offerings where therapists, survivors, more intensive, less intensive, and just free.
So many offerings, so many resources. Like I said, lots of goodies. Go to that website. I will be
Thank you.
providing all the links along with this interview. I can't thank you enough. It's been such a
Thank you.
pleasure. I could talk to you all day, and I look
I could
forward
talk
to
to you all
being in
day.
conversation
Thank you.
again
Me
with
too.
you.
I look forward to us meeting in person and doing this live. Yeah.
Dr. Ramani, thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. It's such a pleasure to talk with you always.
Same. Take good care.
Thanks. You too.